Excuse me,
Oh,
Laurie.
Mr. Brackett, I'm sorry, Mr. Brackett.
Oh, I didn't mean to startle you.
That's all right.
You know, it's Halloween. I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
What's up, everyone? I'm your host, Will, and you're listening to One Good Scare, the show where we explore our favorite horror movies. Today, we're jumping into the movie I consider to be the scariest of all time, The Exorcist. And here's the thing, I'm not the only one who thinks so. Rotten Tomatoes, IMDb, Collider all have it at number 1. Screen Rant has it at number 2 behind Psycho, so I can't be too mad about that. But my point is, The Exorcist is inarguably one of the scariest movies ever made. A couple of things before we dive in, because this is going to be a longer episode. We'll be exploring the version you've never seen, which was released in theaters in 2000, and includes about 12 minutes of footage not shown in the theatrical version from 1973. It also includes the infamous spider walk scene. I chose this version because I actually saw it in theaters when it released, which to this day was one of my favorite horror movie experiences in a movie theater. I also prefer this version of the movie because it feels more complete, and this was director William Friedkin's preferred version of the film as well. Initially, I had plans to cover this movie in 2 episodes, but the more I thought about it, the more I wanted to just get it done in one shot. The goal of this show is to explore our favorite horror movies every single week, so I'm really trying not to drag out one movie over multiple episodes. So make sure to buckle up because The Exorcist is a wild ride. As always, you can follow One Good Scare on Instagram at OneScarePod and on TikTok at OneGoodScarePod. Make sure to follow and leave a comment or two. I love interacting and discussing. Also, be sure to leave a 5-star review on Spotify and Apple Pods. It lets me know you're enjoying the show, and that goes a long way to keeping it going. And remember, my goal with One Good Scare is not to replace your viewing experience, it's to enhance it. So if you haven't seen The Exorcist, or if it's been a while, my strong encouragement is to do that first, and then come back and give the show a listen. Of course, if you'd rather listen than watch, I appreciate that as well. Just remember, one good scare is one gigantic spoiler. Okay, enough with the housekeeping. You're here to dive into one of the scariest movies of all time. So let's get to it. The groundwork for The Exorcist was laid not in 1973 when it released in theaters, or even in 1971 when William Peter Blatty published a novel, but in the 1940s with a young boy named Roland Doe. I won't go into detail here, but if you're interested in hearing the backstory to the novel and movie, listen to my other show, The Red Treehouse, Episode 10. What you may not realize is that The Exorcist was inspired by a true story, which is equally as scary as the novel and movie. Like every movie, The Exorcist is a sort of cultural time capsule. And to understand both its hype and legacy, we have to first understand the climate in which it was released. Because truly, when it hit theaters in December 1973, it was the first of its kind. No one had ever seen anything like it before. The Exorcist wasn't just scary. It was bold, unapologetic, and in your face. It's important to keep in mind that most of the horror movies we know and love today were still years away from being released. In fact, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which released in October 1974, was still over 10 months away from its release. More than just being a great horror movie, The Exorcist was a great movie. In fact, it was nominated for 10 Academy Awards, and it won 2 for Best Adapted Screenplay and Best Sound. Even now, nearly 52 years later, the rankings reflect its status as an absolute horror classic. A 4 out of 5 on Letterboxd, 78% on Rotten Tomatoes, and an 8.1 out of 10 on IMDb, giving it the distinction of being the number 228th movie of all time. And of course, the most important, my own personal ranking of number 1 on my all-time list. When The Exorcist was first released, there were reports of people having panic attacks and passing out in theaters. Others complained of chest pain and lightheadedness. More than a few people threw up, and a lot left the movie early. Of course, we look at this today and wonder how this was possible. But think of it this way. If you had never seen anything like this before, you'd have no point of reference for what it was, and you'd be entirely unprepared for what was coming. The Exorcist caused an uproar, and not just with filmgoers. Famed evangelist Billy Graham strongly denounced the film and claimed it was a portal for evil. He believed the movie was a form of spiritual warfare, and famously stated, quote, "The devil is in every frame of this film," end quote. Some people took that literally, and claimed the devil was in the actual celluloid of the film. And while this obviously isn't true, there were a few strange occurrences on the set of The Exorcist, including the deaths of several people connected to its production. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, it's time to jump into the movie. So settle down, turn down the lights, and enjoy the masterpiece that is The Exorcist. The movie opens with a nighttime shot of a brick house. The upstairs light is on before turning off. The camera pans right, towards the street, where a couple is shown walking arm in arm. A quick cutscene shows the head of a statue of the Virgin Mary, before cutting to a black screen, with the words, "A William Friedkin film," in red lettering. Then, William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist, before fading to black. Middle Eastern music plays in the background as the scene opens with the sun radiating in the desert. We're taken to what appears to be an archaeological dig in northern Iraq. The camera pans away, showing the expansive dig site, with the sounds of shovels and pitchforks banging away. A young boy, wearing a red checkered head covering, runs along the site, seemingly rushing to look for someone. Finally, he arrives at his destination and declares they've found something at the base of the mound. An older man gets up from where he'd been digging and walks through the site towards the base of the mound. He is told they found some interesting artifacts, and he picks up a pendant. Another man brushes it off and says that it's not of the same time period as the other artifacts. The older man looks to his left and sees a pile of rocks in a small hollowed-out cave. He stoops low and moves a few rocks around before using his pickaxe to drag something out. It's a small statue. Using the brush of the other man, he cleans it off and separates it from the rock. You can see his expression change as he looks at it, and it seems like he knows what this small statue represents. The scene shifts to an outdoor market, where the man, with trembling hands, takes a small pill out of a case and washes it down with a cup of tea. He stares into the distance, looking exhausted, while others go about their business. A waiter asks if he needs anything else, which the man refuses. A quick cutscene takes us to a blacksmith's workshop, where several men are pounding metal on an anvil, heat on top of heat. The next scene takes us indoors, where the older man, whose name we still don't know, is cataloging artifacts in a notebook. A clock ticks in the background. He picks up the pendant, and we see that it says Saint Joseph, pray for us, in Latin. He then picks up the statue from earlier, and another man says, evil against evil. Suddenly, it's quiet as the older man notices the clock has stopped ticking. He walks over to it, before sitting down in a small chair. A quick dialogue between the two men reveals the older man is leaving northern Iraq to do something. We watch as he walks out of the building, through a courtyard, market, and neighborhood. He's seemingly in his own little world, and he is almost trampled by a horse-drawn carriage while approaching an intersection. A quick scene shows him driving a small jeep back towards the dig site, where he walks through the ruins. As he stands there, surveying the site, a shadow is cast on his face, and when he looks to his left, he he sees a tall statue partially blocking the sun. He walks up to the ruins, where he comes face to face with a tall statue. Wild dogs snarl and fight in the background, and as he looks at the statue, we see that it's an evil spirit of some kind, and that it has the same face as the small statuette he found earlier in the day. A wide-view camera shot shows the man facing the demon statue, insinuating some kind of battle is going to occur. The snarling of the wild dogs gets louder as the scene cuts back to the bright sun shining in the desert, before fading. The scene immediately picks up with an angled aerial shot of the Key Bridge with the word Georgetown in the lower left corner. Traffic moves swiftly as the camera pans in on a two-story home. Inside, a woman turns on a table lamp, and we see that she's writing a note of some kind and preparing to light a cigarette. As she writes, a strange rustling noise catches her attention, and she slips out of bed to investigate. She puts on a robe as she leaves the room and walks around the house, looking up and down. She hears the noise again, and this time believes it's coming from the attic. She checks in on her daughter, who is sound asleep, and notices the bedroom window is wide open. She walks across the room to close it, before pulling the covers up around her daughter's shoulders. Okay, really quick. We're about 12 minutes into the movie, and so far not much has happened, at least not in the way of action. But there are a few important details to be mindful of. First, it feels like you're watching a documentary. To this point, there has been very little music, and all of the sounds seem amplified. Shovels and pickaxes pounding, clocks ticking, rocks moving and rolling underfoot. The audio engineering is absolutely terrific. It seems William Friedkin isn't planning to use a score to scare us. He's gonna do it by turning up the volume on ordinary, everyday sounds. Also, the fade-out, fade-in shot of the sun turning into Georgetown clues us into something important. Whatever battle is going to take place, it won't be in the desert halfway across the world. It'll be just outside the nation's capital, in a house, just like you or I would live in. It's as if this transition is telling us, evil transcends distance and culture. Watch as it cozies up next to you, and in this case, inside of you. The next scene takes us downstairs, where the woman walks into the kitchen as her housekeeper makes breakfast. The two exchange pleasantries as another man, Carl, walks in. The woman tells him there are rats in the attic. He objects, stating the attic is clean. She grows increasingly annoyed as the conversation goes on, finally ending it by telling him to get traps and put them upstairs. He obliges and says he will go now, but she objects, saying the stores aren't open. The scene shifts to Georgetown University, as an indistinguishable voice bellows from a bullhorn. We watch as a movie is being filmed on campus, and as the woman from earlier steps out of a trailer and calls to Burke, the film's director. Okay, a quick fun fact. If you pause the scene as Burke turns around, you'll notice a man to the right. He's wearing a brown overcoat. That's William Peter Blatty, the author of The Exorcist. Burke walks towards the woman, who objects to a specific scene. He tries to clarify, but she continues to express frustration with the scene at hand. Burke disarms the woman and the two laugh and share a hug, as the camera gives us a quick view of a priest in the crowd. The woman, now in makeup, is about to film the questionable scene. It's a protest, and it seems as though students are upset a building on campus is about to be torn down. The scene pans out to the priest we saw earlier. He's carrying a briefcase and walking away. The scene moves to the outskirts of the campus, as the woman is walking back towards her driver. She tells him she'll walk home, and as she does, we hear haunting music start. Tubular Bells by Mike Oldfield. Kids trick or treat as she walks home, and as the leaves fall around her, she strolls past a local Catholic church where two men are talking in a courtyard. One of the men is the priest from earlier. She notices him and stops for a second to watch. The two are in heavy conversation. As they talk, a jetliner flies overhead, drowning out the conversation. The woman walks away and walks into her home, where another woman, Sharon, is sitting at the kitchen table. The two make small talk as Sharon hands her the mail, and as she walks away, we hear a young voice say, "Hi, Mom," and a preteen girl bounces into the kitchen. She kisses her mother hello, and the two talk about her day. The girl mentions a beautiful gray horse, a gelding, that she saw earlier. As she tries to convince her mother to buy her a horse, we learn her name is Reagan. She steals a cookie from the cookie jar, and she and her mother run playfully towards the staircase, where they laugh and carry on. Alright, so these scenes are important, even though they may feel like filler. First, we learn the woman is an actress, and that she's in the Georgetown, Washington, D.C. area temporarily. We also learn she has a young daughter, Reagan, who appears innocent and childlike. This presentation of Reagan is intentional, because the point is to show the contrast of who Reagan actually is, an innocent preteen girl, versus who Reagan becomes, a full-fledged demon. This contrast is supposed to be shocking, and trust me, it's exactly that. The scene cuts to a train station in New York City, with the priest from earlier walking up the stairs to the train platform. As he looks down the tunnel at an oncoming train, a voice from behind him calls out,
"Can you help an old altar boy, Father?"
The priest looks back at the man before walking away. We then watch as he crosses the street into a rundown neighborhood. Trash everywhere, abandoned cars being stomped by kids, and into an apartment building. He climbs the staircase, where he opens an apartment door. He turns the light on and sets his jacket on the bed and collar on the armoire. He unbuttons his collar as he walks through the apartment and calls out, "Mama." Through a set of double doors is the priest's mother, who pops up brightly when he walks in. She calls him Dimmy. The two hug and exchange loving words before he sits down to eat a meal. She's sitting in a rocking chair and tells him that her brother came by to see her the month before. We see him wrapping her leg carefully, asking if the bandage is too tight. She says no. He reminds her she has to be careful, to which she agrees. He then tries to convince her to leave the apartment, but she objects profusely, saying, "This is my house, and I'm not going no place." He realizes she won't budge. She senses something is wrong, and though she tries to get it out of him, he's not budging either. We watch as he places money on a table, turns up the radio, and leaves the apartment, his mother asleep in a rocking chair. The scene then shifts back to the home in Georgetown, where Reagan has made some kind of clay bird. She shows her mother, who sets it down to dry. As she does, she asks Reagan, "Hey, where'd this come from?" before pulling out a Ouija board. Reagan says she found it in the closet, and then says she's been playing with it. Reagan and her mother start to play with it, but when the woman goes to place her hands on the planchette, it moves quickly in the other direction. She's convinced Reagan doesn't want her to play, but Reagan says Captain Howdy said no. She asks about Captain Howdy, and Reagan says, "You know, I make the questions, and he does the answers." She feigns recognition as Reagan says he's nice. Reagan then tries to play with the Ouija board by herself, with no response from Captain Howdy. Okay, so there are a couple of really important scenes here. First, to this point we still don't know the priest's actual name, just a pet name, Dimmy, that his mother uses. We see that she's not in great health and that he's really worried about her, and try as he might, he can't convince her to leave her apartment. Jason Miller, who plays the priest, is terrific in these scenes. You get a sense of his concern, sadness, and frustration, less through his dialogue, and more in his face and body language. The man is emoting without verbalizing. Second, the cutscene with Reagan and her mother in the basement is the hinge on which the entire movie swings. Pay close attention to the dialogue, especially when Reagan says she's communicating with some sort of quote-unquote nice thing, Captain Howdy. Also a detail that's super easy to miss, Reagan has been playing, and in this scene, plays with, the Ouija board by herself. One of the official rules of the Ouija board is not to play with it alone. It is believed that doing this makes you more vulnerable to harmful or evil spirits, and may open you up to demonic attachment or possession. I know what some of you are thinking because I've heard the comment over and over again. The Ouija board is just a toy. But that's only partly true, because when the Ouija board was first patented in the 1890s, it wasn't a child's plaything. It was a spirit board, whose roots were in spiritualism, and whose goal was to communicate with the dead. Also, someone on TikTok rightly pointed out that Reagan never says goodbye to the board, meaning the portal, the door to the spirit world, was left fully open. Also, I'm too chicken shit to play with a Ouija board, and I promise you, if one of my kids brought out a board and the planchette moved on its fucking own, I'd gather everyone outside and burn the house down. These scenes with Father Karras and his mother, and Reagan and her mother, when shown back to back, reveal a dual narrative that at some point is going to meet in the middle. Let's keep going. The scene moves to Reagan's bedroom, where she's reading a magazine before heading to bed. There's a sweet interaction between Reagan and her mother about what she wants to do for her upcoming birthday. They toss out a few ideas, which Reagan appreciates. She hugs her mother and says, "You can bring Mr. Dennings if you like." Mr. Dennings is Burke, the director. Confused, she asks Reagan why she would do that, and Reagan misunderstands their relationship as being romantic. The two laugh, and we learn that the woman is a single mom, and that Reagan's father is somewhere out there. Reagan continues to joke about her mother being in love with Burke, and the conversation ends when she assures Reagan they are just friends. The scene shifts to a bar, where the priest is grabbing a couple pints of beer. He sits at a table with another older priest. He tells him about his mother, who he regrets leaving in New York. For the first time, we learn Dimmy's first name, Damien. The older priest mentions a transfer, but Father Damien tells him he needs a reassignment and that his job is wrong. It's no good. The older priest reminds Damien he is the best they have, but Damien objects, saying his role is more than psychiatry and delves into matters of faith. And we learn in this conversation that Father Damien is a psychiatrist. He puts out a cigarette, and as he swigs his beer, says, quote, "I need out. I'm unfit. I think I've lost my faith, Tom." End quote. Okay, really quick. This scene is super important because it's giving us layers of Father Damien's character. We know he's a priest, and that will come into play later. But right now, we know he's a priest, and actually a psychiatrist, whose faith is failing, possibly because of the nature of his work, and possibly because of the situation with his mother. Whatever it is, it's really doing a number on him, and he's down in the dumps. The scene moves back to the home in Georgetown, where we learn the woman's last name, McNeil. She's on the phone with an operator trying to get a hold of Reagan's father, who hasn't called her on her birthday. As the camera pans out, we see Reagan tucked inside the doorway of her bedroom, eavesdropping. Her sadness is palpable as she sits on her bed. The scene cuts to the middle of the night, where Miss McNeil is startled awake by a phone call. She answers and gets up to film a scene for the film. She discovers Reagan in bed with her, who tells her, "My bed was shaking. I can't get to sleep." The scene then cuts to the attic door, which is in the ceiling in the hallway. rumbling noises are heard behind it, and Miss McNeil steps into the hallway and grabs the pull bar, opening the attic for her to climb into. She tries the light, but there's no power, so she lights a candle and climbs the staircase. She walks around, scanning the attic for signs of rats or anything else, and she's bewildered when she sees an empty rat trap tucked into the corner. The camera moves parallel to her as she walks along the attic, and as she reaches the staircase, she hears the rumbling noise behind her. She takes a few steps back, and suddenly the candle flame becomes a blowtorch as Carl calls to her from the opening. He tells her, "You see, no rats." The scene cuts to a Catholic church, where a priest is carrying 2 flower pots and walking towards the sanctuary. He steps inside and kneels in reverence before placing a flower pot on one side of the room. As he walks to the other side, presumably to place the other flower pot, he stops dead in his tracks. The statue of the Virgin Mary has been desecrated, with bloody horns protruding from the breasts and a bloody horn, simulating a penis, protruding from the lower genital area. Next, we find ourselves in a waiting room of a doctor's office. Reagan is called back, and we get a close-up shot of her getting her blood drawn and having a few tests done. In a close-up shot of Reagan's face, we see her eyes widen, and a split-second cutscene of a white demonic face flashes across the screen. The medical tests continue as Reagan mostly ignores her doctor. Suddenly, the sweet Reagan we've come to know looks up at the doctor and says sternly, "I don't feel anything." The tests continue, with Reagan's doctor taking her temperature. Suddenly, she snatches the thermometer from him and growls, "I don't want it." A nurse looks over as we hear Reagan moaning in the background, and we see Reagan vertical planking on a doorway, humming and moaning as she floats around the room, before settling on the floor. The scene cuts to Miss McNeil, who is waiting for the doctor to give her an update. He comes in and says, "Disorder of the nerves. At least that's what we think it is." Apparently, Reagan is experiencing some sort of health trouble, which affects her concentration. The doctor prescribes 10 milligrams of Ritalin, though he is still unsure about the cause of Reagan's affliction. He suggests depression, which Miss McNeil rejects flatly. She asks if she should take Reagan to a psychiatrist, but the doctor says to wait a few weeks. Miss McNeil then asks the doctor about the lies Reagan has been telling, like that her bed shakes at night. The doctor redirects by asking if she has ever known Reagan to swear. Miss McNeil says no, but the doctor says she let loose with quite a string. When pressed on what Reagan said, the doctor reveals she told him, quote, "to keep my fingers away from her goddamn cunt," end quote. Miss McNeil laughs, though her concern is still there. They agree to wait a few weeks before consulting a psychiatrist. The scene moves to Damien and another man bursting through a hospital door, the tension palpable. It's obvious his mother is in declining health, and as the two walk through the hospital, we discover she's been placed on the psychiatric unit. We also learn Damien's last name, Karras, and that the other man is his uncle. Karras looks in at the various patients, concern growing. While he does this, his uncle tells him that if he weren't a priest, Karras would be a famous psychiatrist and that his mother would be living in a penthouse instead of a hospital. Karras steps into the room, where his mother is laying infirm in a hospital bed. He calls to her, but she looks over with tears in her eyes and says,
"Timmy, won't you do this to me? Please, Timmy. I'm afraid."
He moves in to embrace her, but she turns her head away from him. The scene then moves to the outside of the hospital, where Karras and his uncle talk about moving his mother somewhere else. The uncle says they don't have the money to move her, and all but accuses Karras of causing the situation. A quick cutscene shows Karras in a boxing gym, wailing at a heavy bag until he's exhausted. The next scene cuts back to the home in Georgetown, where Miss McNeil is hosting a huge dinner party. Burke is sitting there drunk and complaining about pubic hairs in his drink. A priest is talking to an astronaut. Carl is serving drinks and hors d'oeuvres when Burke comes up and asks if he did public relations for the Gestapo. Carl tells him he's Swiss. Burke persists, calling Carl a Nazi. Miss McNeil is then shown talking with a priest, Father Dyer, and another party guest about the church with the red brick. She asks about the priest she saw, and she is told he is Damien Karras, a psychiatric counselor. We then learn a crucial piece of information. Damien Karras' mother passed away the night before. She was living alone and had been dead a few days before she was found. A cutscene takes us to the kitchen, where Burke is pestering Carl, calling him a bloody, damned butchering Nazi pig. Carl flips out and begins strangling Burke before he is pulled away. Burke plays it off and asks, "What's for dessert?" Okay, really quick. There have been a few odd interactions between Burke and Carl, and in each one, Burke is calling him names and generally being a pain in the ass. Outside of these interactions, Carl is a side character, which is a major difference between the movie and novel. In the book, Carl and his wife Willie are more prominent, and author William Peter Blatty offers the reader a pretty extensive and fascinating backstory. A quick scene moves to Reagan's bedroom, where she is asleep. Miss McNeil pulls the cover over her shoulders, kisses her cheek, and closes the window. Reagan opens her eyes and stares into the distance. Burke is shown being helped out the door, stumbling drunk and barely able to stand on his own 2 feet. He walks out into the night, and Miss McNeil heads back into the living room, where a few guests have gathered around the piano. Father Dyer is playing, and the group begins singing a song, when Reagan steps into the room. Father Dyer sees her and stops playing, just as Reagan looks at the astronaut and says, "You're going to die up there." She then pees all over the living room carpet. Horrified, Miss McNeil moves quickly to take Reagan upstairs and lets the guests know she has been sick. The next scene cuts to her giving Reagan a quick bath before getting her in bed. Reagan asks, "What's wrong with me?" Miss McNeil tells her it's just nerves, and that if she takes her pills, she'll be just fine. She then walks out of the room and downstairs, where Willie the housekeeper is scrubbing the urine out of the carpet. Suddenly, a loud banging fills the air as Reagan calls frantically for her mother. Miss McNeil runs upstairs and opens Reagan's bedroom door, where she is horrified to see the bed shaking violently up and down, Reagan still atop. She jumps into the bed with Reagan, but it's no use. The bed continues jumping violently. Something really interesting in this scene. Reagan's bed is a marvel of practical effects and is really the centerpiece of the entire movie. With the exception of a few scenes, everything of importance occurs in Reagan's bedroom, and actually, in the bed itself. Marcel Vercouter, the mechanical effects supervisor for the film, had one of the most difficult jobs on the entire set. I'll talk more about the bed later on in this episode, but keep that tucked away for now. The next scene cuts to the priest from the party visiting Damien Karras. The two smoke cigarettes and drink whiskey as Karras cries about losing his mother. Father Dyer puts him to bed, and Karras falls asleep, where he has a terrifying nightmare. The pendant of St. Joseph falls from an unknown height, followed by a black dog running. A flash of Damien's mother is replaced by a ticking clock. Suddenly, we see his mother walking up the staircase of a train station as Karras calls out to her from an opposite corner. She is calling out to him, "Dimmy," when suddenly the white-faced demon flashes into the scene for a split second. Damien is running towards his mother, yelling "Mama," but she's already walking down the staircase of the train station, just out of his reach. The St. Joseph pendant crashes on a rock, and we're startled by Reagan screaming at a doctor, "I don't want it." And this is the end of Act 1. Alright, let's break this down and talk about a few things. We're about 48 minutes into the movie, with another 80 or so to go. To this point, there isn't much action, but that doesn't mean nothing is happening. Director William Friedkin is taking his time, building the story and characters, making us care about Miss McNeil, Reagan, and Damien Karras. We know some bad shit is going to happen to these people, and it's always more horrifying if we empathize with them first before it happens. The acting performances have been outstanding. We can feel the confusion of Miss McNeil as she tries to find answers for Reagan's struggles. We can see the changes in Reagan as something seemingly takes control of her. We connect with Damien Karras as he laments the loss of faith and grieves the loss of his mother. We know we're headed for something big, and that it involves all three of them, but we're just not sure exactly what that is. Also, it's easy to forget the opening scene, the one in the desert. It's just hanging in the air. We know it's important. Why else would it be included? But we still don't know why or how. Right now, there are more questions than answers, and the foreshadowing leaves us unsettled and unsure of whether or not we want to know. Earlier, I briefly mentioned the audio engineering in this movie. With exception of one scene, we've only heard music twice, near the beginning. Every other sound is amplified and fills the air around you. It lends a certain realism to the movie. Again, it feels like we're watching a documentary. I'll talk more about this later, but it's important to tuck it away, because this was intentional. Act 2 picks up with Reagan at the doctor's office, her mother pleading with her while she attempts to break free from 3 nurses. A doctor, the same one as earlier, draws a syringe and injects Reagan in the arm. She spits in his face and yells, "You fucking bastard." A quick cutscene takes us to the sanctuary of a church, where Father Karras is conducting Mass. He prays for his mother before administering the Lord's Supper. The next scene takes us back to the doctor's office, as the doctor and Mrs. McNeil discuss the results of Reagan's tests. He believes it's a lesion in the temporal lobe, and that may have caused hallucinations and the convulsions of her bed. Miss McNeil responds by telling him the bed was shaking with her on top of it too. He responds, "The problem is with your daughter, not her bed." The two walk into his office, where he explains how a lesion in the temporal lobe could change Reagan's personality and behavior. Overwhelmed, Miss McNeil asks for good news, to which the doctor says it may be possible to remove the scar from Reagan's brain. Reagan is then taken by 2 staff members for a series of tests. Okay, something super fascinating in this scene. When Reagan is getting some tests, there's a guy in the background who helps Reagan get into position. The man's name is Paul Bateson, and he was cast in the film basically for the sake of realism. He was on staff at the office where the scene was shot, and to make the scene as authentic as possible, he along with a few others were included in the film. That's not what's super interesting, but here's something that is. In 1979, Paul Bateson was convicted of the murder of a journalist, Addison Verrill, and was sentenced to at least 20 years in prison. But that's not all. Paul Bateson was also suspected in the murders of several individuals in New York City between 1975 and 1977, though he was never formally charged in the case. Reagan appears to have some difficulty concentrating, and is out of it as the staff continue setting her up for testing. They attach electrodes for readings, draw blood, and take images of her brain. But despite everything they've done, they can find no answer for her recent behaviors. Real quick, according to a few different articles, quite a few people passed out at the scene where Reagan gets a line put in her neck. The squirting blood made folks dizzy, lightheaded, and prone to passing out. As the doctors look at the scans of Reagan's brain, they're confounded with what they find. Absolutely nothing at all. Then a nurse walks into the office and says Chris McNeil, we've now learned her first name, is on the phone, and she says it's urgent. The next scene takes us to the McNeil home. where the doctors are let in and immediately taken upstairs. On the way, they're told Regan is having spasms and that they've gotten violent. You can hear Regan yelling and screaming in the background. When the doctors walk in, they're horrified to find Regan thrashing on the bed. She's bent at the waist and being tossed back and forth. Regan is pleading for it to stop and yells, "It's burning! It's burning!" The adults watch helplessly as Regan is tossed in the air, up and down off the bed. She continues pleading for it to stop, calling out for her mother. Suddenly, she's tossed onto the bed, and as her head hits the pillow, her eyes roll back, and she lets out a low, guttural growl. Her throat swells, and as Dr. Klein walks towards her, Regan stands on the bed and backhands him in the face, growling in an unnatural voice. "Keep away. The sow is mine." She then kneels on the bed and pulls her nightgown up, yelling, "Fuck me, fuck me, fuck me," before being tossed back onto the bed. Regan is hysterical as she is tossed around and is slapped by an unseen hand, a distinct handprint showing on her cheek. Chris MacNeil can barely hold it together. Dr. Klein then administers medication, likely intended to sedate Regan, and Chris is taken out of the room. The next scene shows Chris and Sharon talking outside Regan's bedroom. The doctors come out and let her know Regan is heavily sedated and will likely sleep through until the next day. Chris asks how she could have done that, and the doctors tell her it's part of the brain lesion. Chris isn't buying it and says, "Did you see her or not? She's acting like she's fucking out of her mind." The doctors attempt to calm her down and discourage her reaching out to a psychiatrist. They want to conduct a few more tests, including a spinal tap. We're then taken back to a hospital as more tests are conducted, all of which show up normal. Dr. Klein tells Chris that it's time to contact a psychiatrist. Chris drives home, a long road ahead of her, when she passes a large police presence at the base of the steps behind her house. As she walks in, the kitchen lights flicker and the phone rings. She answers and quickly hangs up, and as she walks through the kitchen, the lights suddenly turn off again. As they turn on, we see a quick flash of the white-faced demon from Father Karras' dream. Chris walks into Regan's bedroom, where the window is wide open. But just before she opens the door, we catch a quick glimpse of the demon statue from earlier in the movie. Chris looks over at Regan, who is asleep in her bed, and moves to close the window, her breath visible. She pulls the covers up on Regan before walking out of the room and downstairs. The camera keeps us back towards the window in Regan's bedroom. And on the left, we see a shot of the demon statue silhouetted against the dark side wall. Chris storms downstairs, upset that Regan was left alone while Sharon went out to run an errand. Sharon tells Chris that Burke stopped by and that she left him with Regan while she went to get the Thorazine from the pharmacy. She quickly realizes she should have known better. Just then, the doorbell rings, and when Chris answers, she is told that Burke was found dead at the bottom of the stairs. He was drunk and presumed to have fallen down the stairs, breaking his neck. Chris is overwhelmed and slams her fist into the wall. As she collects herself, hands trembling, she turns and looks towards the stairs, where Regan is walking backwards, like a spider, down the staircase, blood dripping from her mouth. Okay, so this is one of the most iconic scenes in the entire movie. And did you know that it was left out of the theatrical release in 1973? At the time that it was filmed, William Friedkin found it impossible to edit out the wires attached to the harness, attached to the actress who did the spider crawl. And so because of those constraints, it was ultimately left on the cutting room floor. Until nearly 30 years later, when the film was re-released and CGI was used to remove the wires, giving us the scene that we've all come to know and love, and that haunts our nightmares. The scene fades to black before picking up with Regan sitting in a chair staring off into the distance. She is being hypnotized and asks several questions, including, "Is someone inside of you?" Reagan acknowledges and says she's afraid and wants the person inside to leave her. The hypnotist addresses the person inside Reagan, who is also hypnotized. He tells it to come forward and answer me now. Suddenly, a picture of Reagan falls off a mantel, and a growling can be heard as a pungent smell fills the room. The person inside Reagan is now glaring at the hypnotist, and as he asks, "Who are you?" Reagan's face changes into the white demon, and she grabs him by the balls, forcing him to the ground, screaming in pain. The next scene shows us Father Karras running around an outdoor track, a man in a fedora and overcoat watching from the bleachers. As Karras circles back, he stops by the bleachers and grabs a towel. The man in the fedora calls out to him and identifies himself as William F. Kinderman, homicide. He attempts to make small talk to ingratiate himself to Karras, who walks away. Kinderman walks him down and mentions Burke's death from a few days before. He mentions witchcraft, and Karras says he once wrote a paper on it from the point of view of a psychiatrist. Kinderman mentions the desecration in the church, and Karras tells him it may have the markings of Black Mass. Kinderman then reveals how Burke died. He was found at the bottom of the stairs, with his head turned all the way around. He says it likely didn't happen in the fall. The two continue walking as Kinderman ponders the possibility, and asks Karras if any priests have come to him that may fit the description of a possible murderer. Karras doesn't have an answer, and Kinderman tells him about a psychiatrist who was jailed for not cooperating with police. Karras, incensed, tells him that he could always say it was a matter of confession. The next scene is at the Behringer Clinic, where a video feed shows Reagan acting erratically while confined to a bed. A voiceover of a doctor indicates that Reagan may have a primitive form of possession, which they don't know much about, except that it's built on the patient's delusion that they're being taken over by a hostile spirit. Reagan's treatment team is meeting with Chris MacNeil, who refuses to have Reagan placed in a hospital. The doctor suggests exorcism as a shock treatment. Chris and Reagan are back at the house, while Kinderman walks along the bottom of the stairs where Burke died. Okay, real quick. The famous Exorcist stairs are somewhat the result of movie magic. A few years ago, I had a chance to walk the stairs while waiting for my passport to be processed. Anyway, the stairs are as steep and narrow as you'd think from watching the movie. And truly, if you fell down the full length of the stairs, you likely would either be super injured, or you'd be dead. But there's something interesting. While the stairs are next to the Exorcist house, they're not close enough for someone to jump or be pushed out a window and directly land on the staircase itself. The movie makes you think the stairs are directly below Reagan's window, when in reality, they're at least 75 to 100 feet away. Also, and this is just me, I find William Kinderman to be the most obnoxious, annoying character in the movie, and I find his scenes to be especially annoying and kind of filler material. That said, he plays a bigger role in the novel, so it's important that he's included in the movie. Chris is then shown putting Reagan to bed, when she finds a crucifix under Reagan's pillow. As Kinderman starts to climb the stairs, he notices something in the grass, a small clay figure. Chris walks out of Reagan's bedroom and asks Carl if he placed the crucifix in Reagan's room. Carl says no. Kinderman walks up the stairs and looks up at Reagan's bedroom window. Chris is upset and wants to know who put the crucifix under Reagan's pillow. Everyone denies it. Just then, the doorbell rings and Kinderman is standing outside. He talks with Chris over a cup of coffee and asks about the night Burke died. Chris tells him Reagan was sedated that night. Kinderman walks through the timeline with Chris and says that Burke had to have been pushed from the window by someone very powerful. Kinderman supposes someone may have stopped by, and that person could have been the perpetrator. The two continue talking and Chris is clearly flustered by Kinderman's presence and theories. He walks over to a small ledge and notices a set of clay figurines, similar to the one found at the bottom of the stairs, and asks Chris to talk with Regan about that night. He then prepares to head out and asks for an autograph. Chris then lets him out and gathers herself by the front door. She turns and walks towards the foyer when she hears a commotion and Regan yelling from upstairs. She rushes to Regan's bedroom and is horrified to see objects flying around the room. And not only that, Regan is stabbing the crucifix into her genitals and screaming, "Let Jesus fuck you! Let Jesus fuck you!" Chris rushes to get the crucifix from Regan, but is overpowered. Regan then puts Chris's face down near her genitals, saying, "Lick me, lick me." She lifts Chris's head, which is now covered in blood, and slaps her across the face, sending Chris crashing to the floor and screaming in pain. Okay, real quick, Ellen Burstyn was actually injured during this scene. What you can't see is the harness strapped to her back. When Regan slaps her in the face, a crew member yanked the harness backwards, sending the actress flying. Except in the take shown in the film, the crew member pulled the harness too hard, sending her crashing to the floor, with all of her weight landing on her tailbone. The scream you hear is real, the pain on her face is real, and the effects of the injury she felt for years were also real. Chris looks out towards the stairs as Sharon comes running, but a chair moves and slams the door shut. A heavy armoire then moves towards Chris, almost pinning her against the wall. Chris scampers away, and as she reaches the bedroom door, we see a horrifying shot of Regan's head turning completely around with a grotesque smile on her face. She says, in Burke Denning's voice,
Do you know what she did? Your canting daughter?
The next scene shows Father Karras walking towards a small bridge where Chris is waiting in the middle. He calls to her and introduces himself. He lights a cigarette for her as the two make small talk, and she asks how a shrink became a priest. He says it was the other way around. His credentials are impressive, and she makes the connection to Father Dyer, the priest at her party. She asks if Dyer told him about Regan. He says no. She asks about a person who confesses a crime. Would they have to be turned in? Karras says no. Then she drops a bomb. How does a person go about getting an exorcism? She asks again, and he tells her that they'd need to get in a time machine because possession doesn't happen anymore, not since they learned about mental illness. He tells her he's never met a priest who has performed an exorcism. She tells him that her daughter needs one. The two go back and forth, and Karras agrees to see Regan after Chris pleads for his help. As the two walk through the door of her home, Chris reveals the black eye she'd gotten from Regan. At the top of the stairs, Carl tells the two it wants no straps. Karras walks ahead into Regan's room. There, lying on the bed, arms stretched out and restrained, is Regan. Her transformation is horrifying, as her eyes have changed color. She has obvious self-harm injuries on her face. Her hair is greasy and dirty, and she has a feeding tube inserted through her nose. Karras says, "Hello, Regan," but she just looks at him. He tells her he wants to help, and she responds in a guttural voice, "You might loosen these straps then." Karras refuses as he walks towards the bed. He introduces himself as Damien Karras, and Regan lashes out, saying, "And I am the devil. Now kindly undo these straps." Karras refuses and tells Regan the devil should be able to make the straps disappear. Regan then refuses, saying it's too gross a display of power. He asks where Regan is, and the demon says, "In here, with us." Karras asks for proof and promises to undo the straps if the demon obliges. Suddenly, a familiar voice comes through, saying,
When you're helping old altar boy, Father.
It's the voice of the homeless man in the subway from earlier in the film. Karis looks at Reagan, confused. Then Reagan says, "Your mother isn't here with us, Karis. Would you like to leave a message?" Karis walks towards Reagan and seeks more evidence, telling Reagan she must know his mother's maiden name. Reagan stares intensely. Karis asks again and is immediately blasted in the face with green vomit. So at this point in the film, we begin to see the full possession of Reagan taking place. The demon is now taking over her face. Her eyes have changed. Her hair is greasy and matted. She has scratches all over her face. And her voice has changed. And it's the voice that really gets you, because with most horror movies you could close your eyes or turn away from the screen. But The Exorcist assaults you visually and audibly. You can close your eyes, but you're going to hear the demon's voice. The movie backs you into a difficult corner. A couple of other details. The pea soup was actually a combination of pea soup and porridge, colored bright green. William Friedkin felt the consistency of pea soup was not up to par, and had it mixed with porridge to thicken it. Also, if you look closely, you can see Karis's disgust as Reagan vomits on him. The plan was for the vomit to hit him in the chest. Except the pump malfunctioned, sending the vomit up a few inches. It hit him right in the face and mouth. His anger and disgust is genuine, because he wasn't expecting it. One final detail before we jump back in. The vomiting scene actually consists of 3 actresses portraying Reagan and the demon. Linda Blair, obviously. Eileen Dietz, the demon who vomits. And Mercedes McCambridge. Just before the demon vomits, you see Linda Blair as Reagan. But if you pause the frame just as the demon vomits, you'll notice it's a different actress. That's Eileen Dietz. And the demon voice, well, that belongs to Mercedes McCambridge, who is often regarded as one of the greatest voice actors ever. You heard that right. The voice of the demon belonged to a woman. To achieve the effect, she undertook a frightening approach, drinking raw eggs, chain smoking, and drinking whiskey. And in some scenes where you can hear the demon struggling, Mercedes McCambridge had herself bound to a chair and was recorded struggling against the restraints. On the surface, this seems like an actor going to great lengths for a role. Except here's the thing. Mercedes McCambridge was a recovering alcoholic who voluntarily ended her sobriety to voice the demon. After leaving the room, Karis looks at a drawing made by Reagan while Chris irons his sweater. He tells her that he doesn't want to make things worse for Reagan and Chris, and she tells him that nothing he does can make it any worse. He continues by saying the church would need specific evidence of possession, speaking in a language she doesn't know. Chris asks what else, but Karis is unsure, telling her she probably knows more about exorcism than most priests. He tells her that Reagan doesn't say she's a demon. She says she's the devil himself. And he tells her he's seen psychotics who say the same thing. He recommends treatment, 6 months under observation in the best hospital. Chris tells him that if Reagan's double were to stand in front of her, with the same voice and same face, she would know it's not her daughter. She demands to know for certain that an exorcism wouldn't do any good. Karis leaves the home, but stops to ask if Reagan knew a priest was coming over. Then, if she knew his mother had recently passed away. Chris says no to both, and Karis walks away after saying goodnight. As he heads back to the university, we see Kinderman watching from his car. A quick glimpse at Reagan's bedroom window shows an eerie shadow moving behind the curtain. In the next scene, we see Father Karis administering Holy Communion, then a sudden change back to Reagan's bedroom, where the demon says through her, "What an excellent day for an exorcism." Karis looks amused and asks, "You'd like that?" The demon responds, intensely. Karis continues, "But wouldn't that drive you out of Reagan?" The demon responds, "It would bring us together." Karis says, "You and Reagan?" The demon clarifies, you and us. Okay, really quickly, again. This scene is one of the most chilling, even though it's nothing more than a conversation. The demon knows Karis is there to assess for an exorcism, and in a very nonchalant, conversational sort of way, threatens him. While Karis intends to drive the demon out of Reagan, the demon intends to unite itself to Karis. It's a creepy bit of foreshadowing that might go unnoticed, and Karis certainly doesn't react in the scene. Karis sits in a side chair, and suddenly the nightstand drawer pops open. Karis asks the demon to do it again, and the demon says twice, in time. The demon then starts speaking in a foreign language, first Latin, then French. Karis hits a tape recorder. It's the evidence he's been looking for. As he presses the demon to continue speaking, it laughs. Karis asks, how long are you planning to stay in Reagan? The demon responds, until she rots and lies stinking in the earth. Karis pulls out a small vial of holy water, and suddenly, for the first time, we see fear in the demon's eyes as Karis walks towards the foot of the bed. This scene really shows the depth of Reagan's transformation. Her eyes are a glowing greenish yellow. Her face is scratched and scarred from self-injury. Her lips are dried, chapped, and peeling. Her hair is greasy, matted, and all over the place. And her chin, neck, and the front of her shirt are caked in vomit. It's at this point we realize we're no longer looking at the 12-year-old girl Reagan. Instead, we're looking at the full-fledged demon named Pazuzu. Karis walks to the foot of the bed and immediately sprinkles holy water across the demon, who reacts violently, and begins crying out in pain. Oh, it burns. It burns. As the demon writhes, it suddenly begins speaking a gibberish-like language, with multiple voices being heard. Karis asks, who are you? But the demon continues screaming and speaking something strange. Karis then walks down the stairs, where Chris is on the phone. He agrees to a glass of scotch, and who can blame him, while he sits there staring at the floor. He asks about Reagan's father, who is in Europe, and tells Chris he should know what's going on. He pulls out the vial of holy water and tells Chris that Reagan reacted violently, except it was regular tap water, not holy water, and that this hurts their case for possession. Unsure of how to respond, Chris drops a bomb on Father Karis. She believes Reagan killed Burke Dennings. Father Karis is stunned. In the next scene, Karis is sitting with a linguistics expert listening to the recording from when Reagan was speaking gibberish. After Karis asks, who are you? The language expert tells him it's a language, English, in reverse. He plays it back, and you can hear multiple voices saying, give her time, let her die. When Karis asked, who are you? The demon responded, I am no one. I am no one. Fear the priest. Fear the priest. Oh, Marin. Marin, Marin. Suddenly, the telephone rings and Karis is startled. Whoever it is, he says he'll be right there. So this is one of the few jump scares in this entire movie. And it's super effective because we've already been set up with listening to eerie and unsettling recordings just before the phone rings. And as creepy as it was to watch the holy water scene, it was far scarier to hear the tape recording played in reverse. Karis heads back to the McNeil house, where Sharon lets him in and takes him up to Reagan's bedroom. She says she doesn't want Chris to see this. As they enter Reagan's room, it's freezing, and you can see their breath in the air. Sharon carefully unbuttons Reagan's nightgown to expose her stomach, and as they watch, the words "help me" form on her stomach, as if scratched into her skin from the outside. And this is the end of Act 2. I'll save most of the rest of my thoughts for when we get through the end of Act 3. So let's just jump right back into it. We then see Karis having a meeting with the higher-up, and they're discussing Reagan's case. Karras is now convinced she's possessed. His superior asks if he'd like to do the exorcism himself, to which Karras says yes. The superior thinks and says it may be helpful to have someone who has experience. Karras agrees, and the superior and another man have a follow-up meeting, where they agree Karras should assist another priest, Lancaster Marin, the priest from the very beginning of the movie, who was at the dig site in Iraq. He's now stateside. They wonder aloud about his health, but say that he conducted an exorcism 12 years before in Africa that lasted for months, and it damn near killed him. We then watch as he is given his orders while walking along a wooded trail. A quick cutscene gives us a close-up of Reagan's demonic face and eyes, wide open, with a sense of knowing. The next scene is one of the most iconic in movie history. On a foggy night, a cab pulls up to the McNeil home, and as it drives away, Marin stands in front of the home under a streetlight, the light from Reagan's bedroom window creating a silhouette against a blue-gray lamppost. A quick cutscene gives us another close-up of Reagan's demonic face and eyes, now fully aware that the battle has begun. This is a terrific 5-second shot, because we know the showdown is about to happen. It acts almost like a tale of the tape, experienced priest and exorcist, Lancaster Marin, taking on strong-willed and evil, possessed Reagan McNeil. Chris opens the door, and Marin introduces himself. As he and Karras meet, the demon yells from upstairs, "Marin," the voice booming through the house. Marin instructs Karras to run back to the residence and get a few necessary items, including holy water and a copy of the Roman ritual. He wants to get started immediately. Karras asks if Marin wants to hear the details of the case, but Marin asks why. This quick 2-second question and response is fascinating, because it puts into view one of the major tensions of this movie. It's not just about good and evil, even though it's primarily that. It's also about faith and science, and the seeming back and forth. Karras is a man losing his faith, putting his trust in science. He wants to share the details of the case. Marin is a man full of faith, putting his trust in God. He wants to perform the exorcism immediately. As Karras runs to get the requested items, Marin's voice is laid over the scene, and he's cautioning Karras against conversing with the demon, telling him the demon will try to confuse them with lies mixed with truth. The attack is primarily psychological, which is powerful. Karras tells Marin that he has seen 3 personalities manifest, but Marin cuts him off by saying, "There is only one." As the two head up to Reagan's room, the demon can be heard groaning and grunting in the background. Marin enters first and takes a second to survey the situation. Reagan is propped up on the bed, arms restrained to the bedposts. The room is ice cold, and their breaths can be seen in the air. Marin walks towards the foot of the bed as Karras closes the door. Reagan looks on as Marin places the Roman ritual and a crucifix on the nightstand beside her bed. He then takes out a vial of holy water and makes the sign of the cross in the air over Reagan. She responds to this by saying, "Stick your cock up her ass, you motherfucking worthless cocksucker." We see Reagan smiling and staring devilishly at Marin, who commands the demon to be silent. Reagan is forced onto the pillow as she screams in pain. Marin then sprinkles holy water on her and Father Karras as the demon writhes in bed. He then opens the Roman ritual to Chapter 2, the rite for exorcism. As he recites the Lord's Prayer, the demon pulls itself up and hocks a green wad of phlegm into Marin's face, hitting him in the glasses and nose. Unfazed, Marin continues reciting the Lord's Prayer, and as he wipes the phlegm from his face, we see Reagan is reacting to this, her head wagging back and forth as her tongue lolls in and out of her mouth. Marin continues, and Reagan's eyes roll to the back of her head. Karras joins in the reading, stunned at what he is seeing. Marin speaks as Reagan continues struggling. Karis continues his responsive reading. Suddenly, Reagan props herself up and starts growling, almost barking at Marin. The demon looks at Karis as he reads and says, "Your mother sucks cocks in hell, Karis, you faithless slime." As the two begin to pray, the bed starts shaking and lifting off the floor, with Reagan still in it. The two continue praying, and Reagan continues struggling, the bed shaking violently. Marin sprinkles holy water on Reagan, who reacts as if she's being burned. Suddenly, the bed lifts off the floor, and Karis is so stunned he forgets his portion of the reading. As he snaps out of it, the bed rocks back and forth before settling on the ground. As the light flashes bright and then dark on Reagan's face, we catch a glimpse of the white demon from earlier. The demon pleads with them to stop, and as Karis looks on, she growls and stares at him, a serpent-like tongue rolling out of her mouth. Marin sprinkles holy water, sending the demon back to the mattress. As he puts his hand on her head, she begins oozing green vomit, which Marin cleans up with his stole. Karis takes it to the bathroom and rinses it in the sink. As Marin collects himself, objects flying about the room. Marin looks exhausted, and as Karis hands him the clean stole, the demon laughs sadistically on the bed. Marin coughs and steadies himself before declaring, "I cast you out, unclean spirit." The demon responds, "Shove it up your ass." Karis looks on as the ceiling begins cracking. The IV crashes to the ground. Doors slam shut, cracking it in half, and the demon yells at him to fuck him. Marin continues with the ritual, and the two kneel beside her bed, with Marin tracing the cross on Reagan's forehead. Suddenly, she picks her head up, sits up in the bed, and the two watch as Reagan's head spins 360 degrees, coming full circle, as Karis says, "Amen." We watch as the demon face from earlier covers Reagan's face, smiling at the priests. The demon yells at Karis, "You killed your mother. You left her alone to die." Karis yells at the demon to shut up, who then responds, "She'll never forgive you, bastard." Another quake sends the men back to the floor, and suddenly the sheets are ripped off Reagan's body, and the restraints tear, freeing her arms. Reagan's eyes roll to the back of her head, and she begins levitating off the bed towards the ceiling. The priests begin declaring, "The power of Christ compels you." They say this 14 times as Marin sprinkles holy water on Reagan, causing the skin on her leg to tear. Reagan remains in the air as the priests declare over and over, "The power of Christ compels you." Suddenly, she begins lowering to the bed before settling on the mattress. Karis moves quickly to tie her hands, and as he goes to restrain her feet, she sits up and clubs him in the back of the neck, sending him to the floor in pain. Marin sprinkles holy water, sending Reagan back to the mattress. He continues praying, but then another quake sends him crashing into the wall. Karis hurries over, and they watch as Reagan sits up in the bed, arms reaching upward, as the demon statue from the beginning of the movie shines in front of her. The demon howls before Marin gets up and continues the ritual. Karis grabs a blanket to cover Reagan, the room still ice cold. Marin says they will need a quick rest before continuing. Marin exits as Karis sits beside Reagan, looking cold and stunned. The two men are shown sitting on the stairs outside Reagan's room. When Marin asks to be excused, he walks into the bathroom, while Karis walks back into Reagan's bedroom. Marin takes his pill case out of his pocket and takes one, hands trembling and slow moving. Karis, standing at the foot of Reagan's bed, sees his mother sitting there, dressed in a white hospital gown. He stares as music plays in the background. As he walks over to the bedside, we see the demon is sweating profusely and breathing heavily. Karis sits next to Reagan and uses a towel to pat her head. Suddenly, the demon speaks. "Why you do this to me, Dimmy?" It's his mother's voice. It continues, "Please, Dimmy, I'm afraid." Karras responds as his mother's voice pleads with him. He checks her breathing with a stethoscope as Marin walks in. Karras tells him Reagan's heart may be failing, and says she will go into a coma if they administer medication. The demon continues speaking as Karras' mother, eliciting a reaction from him. Marin sends him out of the room to gather himself. Marin, now alone with the demon, approaches the bedside and pulls out a crucifix and the holy water. He pulls up the covers on Reagan and makes the sign of the cross. He then kneels to pray and recites the Lord's Prayer. Karras is shown downstairs, head in hands, as Chris MacNeil asks about progress. Karras then gathers himself and heads back upstairs as the doorbell rings. She opens the front door to see Kinderman standing there. Karras walks into Reagan's room and finds Marin slumped on the bed, dead. The demon is sitting in the corner of the bed, staring into the distance. Karras tries to revive Marin, but it's no use. He's gone. Realizing this, Karras picks up his head as the demon laughs maniacally in the corner of the bed. Enraged, Karras grabs the demon and begins punching it on the ground, telling the demon to take me. Suddenly, Karras' eyes glow green and he's pushed back to the floor. He gets up, and we see a first-person point of view of his hands moving to strangle Reagan, who is still on the ground. His face changes from the demon to himself, and in a split second, he yells "No!" before throwing himself out the bedroom window, tumbling down the stairs to M Street. Chris and Kinderman rush into Reagan's room as she huddles in the corner, her window smashed. Kinderman runs to the window, where he sees Karras at the bottom of the stairs in a pool of blood. Reagan continues crying in the corner and calls her mother, Chris now realizing her daughter is back. Kinderman sees Marin dead on the ground as a crowd gathers around the staircase. Father Dyer pushes through the crowd, where he sees his friend on the ground. He administers the last rites as Karras squeezes his hand before dying. The next scene takes us to the daytime, as Chris and Reagan are packing up the house. As she is saying goodbye, Sharon tells her she found something in Reagan's room. It's the St. Joseph pendant. She says goodbye to Sharon, and as they walk out of the house, Father Dyer walks up. Chris tells him Reagan doesn't remember anything about possession or exorcism. We see Reagan, whose facial wounds are now healing. She notices Father Dyer's collar and gives him a kiss before getting in the car and driving off. But as the car pulls away, Chris calls for him and gives him the pendant. As Father Dyer walks, he looks up at Reagan's bedroom window, which is now boarded up. He looks down the stairs and turns to walk in the other direction. The screen fades to black, and The Exorcist flashes in bright red letters. Guys, we've made it through the end of the movie. Easily the scariest movie I've ever seen, and to this day, it still gives me chills. Hell, I had to stop this recording a few different times just to make it through. Alright, there's something really interesting about the final scene, where Father Dyer pushes through the crowd to get to Father Karras. Father Dyer is seen as teary-eyed and trembling as he administers the last rites to Father Karras. This is not just a case of great acting, although it is that. It's also because director William Friedkin smacked Father Dyer flush in the face before filming the scene. In fact, there are a multitude of stories of Friedkin's unorthodox approach, if you want to call it that, to getting great performances, including firing a gun on set, which angered Jason Miller, who played Father Karras. Alright, let's all take a deep breath and let the blood flow through our veins. You know, whenever I mention The Exorcist is the scariest movie of all time, inevitably there are folks who chime in with dissent and denial, and even a few who comment that the movie is boring, slow, and even laughable. But the question is this true? Does The Exorcist hold up over 50 years later, or should it be relegated to the must-watch, not scary bin? I'll try and answer helpfully. I mentioned at the start that movies are a type of time capsule, and I think this is especially true for horror movies. They point us to a specific time in history and culture. And in 1973, the world had never seen a horror movie quite like The Exorcist. It was one of one and in a league of its own. And if you listen to interviews from the time of its release, you'll hear folks constantly say they've never seen anything like it. Think of it another way. If you enjoy possession and exorcism movies, which are your favorites? Then consider those movies carefully. How many have demonic voices and faces, vomit, levitation, strange languages, priests battling against evil forces, etc.? The influence of The Exorcist runs deeper and wider than you may think. On top of that, The Exorcist wasn't just one of the most influential horror movies of all time. It's one of the most influential films of all time. It garnered 10 Oscar nominations, and is the highest-grossing horror film of all time when adjusted for inflation. Yes, I know, the It remake in 2017 technically earned more money. More than that, The Exorcist has influenced decades of possession movies, all hell-bent on capturing the same lightning in a bottle that made The Exorcist a masterpiece. We often say, imitation is the best form of flattery, and this is absolutely the case with this film. A few days before recording this episode, I asked folks on TikTok and Instagram to tell me their experiences watching The Exorcist for the first time. Here are a few. From Maiden X Macabre. I was about 10 years old, and my mom wouldn't let me watch it without my dad and my blankie present. From Chiller's Podcast. I watched it in theaters when they re-released it for the anniversary and included deleted scenes. Loved it, but was terrified. Couldn't sleep with the lights off for a few nights. Quick side note, if you've never listened to Chillers and Thrillers, I highly recommend it. Emma's a great storyteller, and she tells the spookiest stories. From Pop Culture Reflections Pod. I was 10. I didn't understand life, let alone death or demonic spirits, or the fact that a film could scare me as thoroughly as The Exorcist. The terror stayed with me for 32 years. I rewatched it for the first time since that initial experience at 10, when I saw it in theaters for the 50th anniversary. Now, it's one of my favorite horror movies of all time. From Nick Horrorfan, 88. I rented this film in the late 90s, and I may have been 9 or 10. I made it to the hospital scene and turned it off. From Scream Rant Pod. I wish we could remember. It feels like it's always been in the fabric of our being. From Nicole of the Damned. My cousin and I were 11 or 12 and wanted to rent Cruel Intentions, but my aunt wouldn't let us. Instead, she let us rent The Exorcist, as long as we also rented Patch Adams and watched it right after. The logic still confuses me, but The Exorcist became one of my favorites. Never watched Patch Adams again after that. From Whore for Cosmic Gore. I was 12 or 13, and I recorded it off TV. I didn't realize it had been heavily edited, so I didn't really get what the big deal was, till I finally saw a full copy a few years later. From L.G. Wells. I can't say the exact year, but I am sure I watched it with my mom, who used to love horror movies. The more gore, the better. I would have been in junior high, but off for the summer. Probably right after we got cable TV, with the set-top box that had a slider to choose the channel. Yeah, I'm that old. My dad was at work, so it was our horror movie time. My dad was never a fan. I'm sure we had snacks. I was lying prone on the rug right in front of the TV. My mom behind me on the sofa. Not right there, but close enough, just in case. We watched many classic horror movies just like that. From Unexplained Archives 25. The first time our social media manager watched it, they were 11 years old and was tricked by their mom. Their mother told them it was an older movie, so they assumed it was a less scary vintage black and white film. But they found out real quick how wrong they were, and the damage was done by then, and their parents had to invest in a brighter nightlight. And from the Final Couples podcast. The first time I saw The Exorcist, it felt as if I was watching something too taboo. Growing up in the 90s, in my household, this felt like it was at the very peak of movies you shouldn't talk about. But then I finally saw it. Granted, I was a bit older, but I remember it making me feel pretty unsafe. When you think of religion, and you create a cocktail with violence, demonic possession, and a child, and it's your first exposure to all three of those things, it really does stain your mind. As a young guy, it was very adult and eerily real. As a 34-year-old, it's the greatest horror movie of all time, because it does take itself seriously, and it's totally immaculate in the most rotten way. A huge thank you to everyone who commented. I first watched The Exorcist at 9 years old. One summer, I noticed that it was playing on network television, and a few days before, I developed a plan, at least in my own head, to be able to watch the movie that night. On the night that it premiered, I must have gone to the bathroom 50 times, and each time I went back there, I snuck a minute or two of the movie. By the time I went to bed, I felt proud because I'd seen The Exorcist in almost its entirety. But what I didn't know is that network television edited all the crazy parts of the movie. Anyway, the next morning, my mom let me know that my dad had a surprise for me when he got home from work. I love surprises, so I was excited. A few hours later, when he got home, he whipped out this VHS copy of The Exorcist, unedited and in all its glory. And then he made me watch it by myself in a dark room. I sat there wide-eyed, and I came out terrified. But I also developed a deep love for horror that to this day, over 30 years later, continues on. Alright, there's one more question we have to ask and answer. Is The Exorcist a cursed film? I mentioned at the start of the episode that more than a few people believe the movie is cursed, and that evangelical Christians denounce the film as being a portal to the demonic. For their part, the Roman Catholic Church, which obviously features heavily in the film, had more positive things to say about the movie, citing its deep questions about faith and good triumphing over evil. But is it cursed? Let's look at a few strange occurrences. First, there were several injuries on set, including a few major ones. In fact, both Linda Blair and Ellen Burstyn suffered long-term back injuries. Their injuries occurred during filming, and both are in the film itself. Various injuries befell the cast and crew, including reports of a carpenter cutting off his thumb, a janitor who was shot and killed, and more. Also, did you know a fire tore through the set, burning most of it down, with the exception of Reagan's bedroom, where the majority of the film and almost all of the demonic activity occurs? There's something strange and fascinating about the fire. It is said to have occurred during the time when they were filming the exorcism scene, which stopped production for nearly 6 weeks. Once the set was rebuilt, Max von Sydow, who played Lancaster Marin, learned his brother died, and Linda Blair lost her grandfather. Also, several people associated with the production of The Exorcist, or those connected to those associated with the film, actually died, with one article I read claiming anywhere from 4 to 9 people. One of those people was Jack McGowan, who played film director Burke Dennings. Another was actress Vasiliki Maliaros, who played Damien Karras' mother. Coincidentally, both characters died in the film. I already mentioned Paul Bateson, but did you know that he served over 24 years in prison for the murder of Addison Verrill, before being released on parole in 2003? And though he was never charged with the serial murders in New York City, he allegedly confessed to the crimes, though he was never charged because of a lack of evidence. And of course, because this makes absolute sense considering the hysteria this film caused, there are some who believe the devil is in the actual celluloid of the film itself. because it's not enough to claim the movie is a portal to hell. You always have to go one step further. And in this case, that next step is believing the film is demonically possessed. But there's something interesting. William Friedkin himself is reported as saying, quote, "There were strange images and visions that showed up on film that were never planned. There are double exposures in the little girl's face at the end of one reel that are unbelievable." End quote. So what would you do if you thought your film about the devil possessing a child is cursed? Director William Friedkin reached out to Father Thomas Birmingham from Fordham University and asked him to exorcise and bless the set. Though Father Birmingham was unable to perform an exorcism, he did give a blessing in a special ceremony attended by the cast and crew of the film. And after all that, the strange occurrences allegedly stopped. Okay, so before we close this episode, I was doing some research on the Exorcist curse, and I stumbled on a WikiHow page on how to exorcise your house. You heard that right. A DIY home exorcism. Of course, I'm going to tell you how to do it, with the disclaimer that you do so at your own risk. If you have demonic activity going on in your home, it's possible this may make it worse. So just know that. First, find some type of religious talisman. Make sure it's something you have faith in. It does no good, and may make things infinitely worse if you wear or hold something you don't believe in. If you can find more than one, even better. Second, nicely ask the spirit or ghost or demon to leave. Stay calm but firm. Let the spirit know that the physical world is not their place anymore. If asking nicely doesn't work, and you think it's an evil spirit, try Latin, and I'm going to butcher this. Ecce crucis signum, fugiant phantasmata cuncta, which means, behold the emblem of the cross, let all specters flee. Side note, I don't know if this will actually work if you didn't choose a cross or crucifix or other Christian/Catholic talisman. Third, light up some sage. Wave it around the room in a clockwise motion and let the smoke fill the air, especially in those areas where the spirit presence is strongest. Fourth, spread some holy water around the house. Again, I'm not sure how this works if you aren't Catholic, but if you can get some, sprinkle it in the corners of each room, along the doors and window frames, and anywhere else you feel a presence. Fifth, recite prayers from your religious faith. And sixth, leave out kosher salt or raw rice. These are thought to drive away spirits and demons. I guess that's it. The instructions end there. Obviously, I've never done this before, so I can't speak from personal experience, but this seems entirely too uncomplicated. I mean, I've seen dozens, maybe hundreds of exorcism movies, and the ritual is infinitely more complicated than this. Alright, that's my cue to head out. As always, thank you for spending your time with me on One Good Scare. I don't take it for granted. Be sure to follow on social media at One Scare Pod on Instagram and One Good Scare Pod on TikTok. And of course, be sure to join me next episode as we dive into my top 3 found footage films of all time. Till next time, I'm your host, Will. Thanks for hanging out.